A millionaire cowboy heard three men laugh at a widow's daughter's patched boots. Would you look at the Rourke girl? She is walking on harness scraps. Her mother must sew them shut fresh every Sunday. Winnie. Eyes ahead, sweetheart. We are going home. Then he set his cup down on the bar and said one word, and the room emptied like a barrel with the bottom knocked out. The autumn wind came down off the ridge and drove the dust along the boardwalk of Cottonwood Bend. It was September of 1884. 11-year-old Winnie Rourke stood in the doorway of the freight office and stared at her own feet. She wished the plank floor would open and take her. Then came the laughter, sharp and easy, the laughter of men with nothing to lose. Standing at the far end of the bar in a coat the color of old dust was Ezra Coulter. He owned more cattle than the county could count. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene, but his very next word would empty that room down to the flies. Settlement Day came once a month in Cottonwood Bend. The valley people rode in with coins knotted in cloth and stood in line at the freight office to pay what they owed. Della Rourke was 31 years old. She was a widow. Her hands were cracked across the knuckles from wax thread and cold water. She stitched harness for anyone who would pay, and she stitched it well, and it was never enough. Beside her stood her daughter. Winnie was 11. She had dark hair cut straight at the jaw because her mother had no time for braiding. She was a quiet child. She had learned to be quiet the winter the river took her father off the ferry rope. On her feet were a pair of man's boots, cut down at the shaft and stitched twice at the counter. They had belonged to her grandfather. The leather was black and gone gray at the toe. There were 3 patches on the right boot and 2 on the left, cut from a ruined breeching strap and sewn with an awl at the kitchen table. Della knew the boots were poor. Winnie knew it too. They did not complain. They were Rourke's. Winnie's grandfather had been Sergeant Barnabas Rourke. In the last winter of the war, he had walked a wagon column of wounded men 30 miles through frozen mud after the teams gave out. He had gone back down the line 4 times for the ones who fell behind. He came home with a citation, a bad hip, and those boots. The town had put his name on a board outside the church. But a name on a board did not buy flour. It did not pay a note. When the sergeant died, he left a proud name and 40 acres with a river landing on it, and a debt against them. Della laid $9.40 on the counter of the freight office. Marcus Dean counted it without touching it. Dean owned the freight line, the ferry contract, and the long, low building at the end of the street, where men drank and talked and made their arrangements. He was a clean man. His collar was always white. He wrote in his ledger with a fine steel pen, and he never once had to shout at anybody. "That is short," Dean said. "It is what I have," Della said. "The note calls for 22. It called for 12 when my husband signed it." "Interest," Dean said. He turned the ledger a quarter turn so she could see the column and not read it. "And penalties." Out on the porch, 3 men were sitting on nail kegs in the sun. Cyrus Pike drove Dean's ore wagons. The other 2 worked the stock pens. They watched the girl standing in the doorway with her hands behind her back. Pike leaned back and spoke loud enough for the street. "Would you look at those boots? That is harness leather on her feet. She is shod like a mule." Well, she is a Rourke. Sergeant walked 30 miles in the mud, and now the granddaughter walks the boardwalk in the same set. Pride is a fine thing to eat when there is no supper. Winnie did not cry. She lowered her head and looked at the toes of the boots and counted the stitches her mother had put there. She got to 11. At the counter, Della's hands went flat on the wood. She closed her eyes for the space of a breath. She swallowed the words that were burning in her throat, because Cyrus Pike hauled for the man who held her note, and the man who held her note was standing in front of her with a pen in his hand. "Winnie," Della said. Her voice was level. It trembled once at the end. "Come along, please." Winnie came. Della picked up her empty cloth. She took her daughter's hand and they went out past the 3 men on the kegs and down the steps into the dust, and neither of them looked up. They did not notice the tall man who had come out of the doorway of the saloon across the street and stopped dead on the boardwalk. Ezra Coulter had heard all of it. He was 54 years old. He wore a canvas coat, gone pale at the shoulders, a flat hat with a sweat line through the crown, and boots that had been resoled twice. He owned the Bitterroot outfit north of the ridge. He ran 11,000 head and shipped them east on his own contracts, and he had not bought a new coat in 9 years. Coulter watched the widow and the girl go down the street. He watched the way the child put her feet down. Then he turned his head and looked at the boots on that girl for a long moment, and something moved behind his face that no one in Cottonwood Bend had ever seen there. Coulter walked across the street and up the steps and into the saloon. The 3 men on the kegs came in behind him, still talking, still pleased with themselves. The room was full. It was settlement day, and every man in the valley had a coin left and a reason to spend it. Coulter went to the bar and set down a cup he had carried in from the porch. The barkeep hurried over, wiping his hands. "Mr. Coulter, something for you? How long has Dean held the paper on this building?" The barkeep blinked. "Sir, that is not my business to say. It is mine," Coulter said. "I bought it from the bank in Willow Fork on Thursday." The barkeep set down his rag. Coulter reached into his coat and laid a folded document on the bar, and he smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and he did not look at anybody. Then he said it. Closed. The word was not loud. It rolled out low, the way distant thunder comes across a valley when the storm is still an hour off. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a chair scraped. Then another. A man near the stove drained his glass and set it down soft, the way you set something down in a sick room. Cyrus Pike stood in the middle of the floor with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Coulter, we were only having a laugh." Coulter turned and looked at him. His eyes were entirely flat. There was no warmth in them at all. "You were," Coulter said. "You are done now." In 90 seconds, the saloon was empty. The barkeep stood alone behind the bar, with the deed lying in front of him and the flies going in the window light. Coulter picked up the paper, folded it, and put it back in his coat. Then he walked down the street to the freight office. Marcus Dean rose from his desk with his practiced smile already in place. "Mr. Coulter, I have your haulage schedule ready for the spring." "I am not here for haulage," Coulter said. "I want to see the Rourke note." The smile stayed on Dean's face and left his eyes. "That is a private account. Show me the ledger, Marcus." Coulter put his hands on the desk. He was a man who moved half the beef in the county, and every wagon in the territory carried something of his in it somewhere. Policy was a word small men stood behind. Dean opened the drawer. Coulter turned the pages himself. The original note had been $12 a month against a principal of $180, taken by Della's husband to buy a mule and rebuild the ferry landing after the flood. The balance at the bottom of the column was $410. Coulter traced the ink down with one thick finger. "What is this line?" "Penalty," Dean said. "She has come up short 4 times. She came up short by $2.60 in June, and you charged her $15. The company must protect itself." Coulter closed the ledger. The sound of it filled the little room. He understood now. He had ridden the new survey stakes himself in August. The stage road out of Willow Fork was coming down the east bank, and the only place a loaded coach could cross the river between the falls and the flats was a shelf of flat gravel at the bottom of 40 acres belonging to a widow who stitched harness for other people's horses. Dean did not want her money. He wanted her landing. 2 miles out of town, the Rourke place sat in a bend of cottonwoods above the water. The house was small and square. The porch sagged at the north corner, but the yard was raked, and the firewood was stacked in straight courses against the wall, and the ferry rope ran out across the river, taut and freshly tarred. Inside, the kitchen was cold. Della sat at the table with the lamp low. Winnie's right boot was upside down in her lap, and she was working the awl through the counterseam with a leather palm on her hand. Winnie sat on the floor by the stove in one boot, and one wool sock, reading a school primer. "Ma," Winnie said. "Yes, sweetheart. Did Grandpa really walk 30 miles in these?" Della stopped stitching. She looked up at the shelf over the stove. On it lay a folded citation gone yellow at the creases and a brass button off a coat. "He did," she said. "4 times up the line and back. He came home with his feet ruined, and he never once said so." Winnie turned a page. Mr. Pike said pride is a fine thing to eat when there is no supper. Della felt the ache go through her chest and settle. She hated that her girl had heard it. She hated that she could not put good new leather on her daughter's feet and send her down that boardwalk with her chin up. "Mr. Pike is right about that," Della said. She pulled the thread tight and bit it off clean. "And he is wrong about everything else." "What do you mean?" "Pride does not feed you," Della said. "But a person is not measured by what she wears out. She is measured by what she mends. Do you understand me?" Winnie thought about it. She nodded slowly. "I do not mind the boots, Ma. It was a lie. They both knew it. It was a brave lie offered out of love." And Della smiled at it, tired and true. Then the dog stood up and barked at the door. Della went to the window. A wagon was coming up the track behind 2 big dark horses. Wagons meant the freight office or the taxman. Della opened the door with her shawl pulled tight. Ezra Coulter set the brake and climbed down and took his hat off in the cold. "Mrs. Rourke, Mr. Coulter." Her voice was careful. Everybody in the valley knew the man, and nobody could say they knew him. "Has one of my animals been in your fence?" "No, ma'am. Your stock is where it belongs." He walked to the bottom of the steps. In the wagon bed lay a stack of skirting leather, cut and rolled. More good leather than Della had seen in one place in her life. "I was in town this morning," Coulter said. Della's back went straight as a rail. "If you have come out here with charity, you can turn that wagon around. I am not a charitable man, Mrs. Rourke. I am a man who buys what he needs." He nodded at the load. "I have 46 saddle horses, and every set of traces on my place is rotten at the billets. My own man does harness, like a blacksmith does watchwork. They tell me you are the best hand with an awl on this side of the ridge. I will pay standing wages, and I will pay by the piece." Della looked at the leather. She looked at the man. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was handing her money and taking the shame out of it before he handed it over. "And," Coulter said, quieter, "I would ask that the first piece off your bench be a pair of boots for your daughter. Call it earnest money." Winnie came to the doorway. She looked at the leather in the wagon, the way a child looks at a fire on a cold night. "Why?" Della said. Coulter put his hat back on. "Because a town that laughs at a child needs reminding of its manners." He carried the rolls up onto the porch himself, 4 trips, and he did not let her take any of it. At the wagon he stopped and looked down the slope toward the water, where the ferry rope ran out flat and silver in the last light. "Mrs. Rourke, do you hold the landing in the deed, or only the bank above it?" "The landing and the gravel and the rope. My husband's father filed it." "Have you had men on that shelf lately? Men with a chain and a rod?" Della hesitated. 2, in August. I walked down and they rode off. They were not lost, Coulter said. "Bar your door tonight. Marcus Dean learned this afternoon that he does not hold as much as he thought he did. A man like that does not quit. He only changes his hands." He climbed up and took the lines. "I will send my foreman by in the morning." Della barred the door. She did not sleep. At 2:30, the dog began to bark, and it was not a friendly bark, and Della came off the chair with her husband's shotgun already in her hands. She went to the window and stood behind the frame. Down at the water, 2 lanterns were swinging. The men were not coming toward the house. They were going to the rope. Della understood in a breath. Without the rope there was no crossing, and without the crossing there was no landing worth arguing over, and the county would let the road go down the east bank to a shelf Marcus Dean already owned. She went out onto the porch in her nightdress and her coat, and she cocked both hammers, and the double click carried down the slope clean and cold. "Step back from that rope." The lantern stopped. "Joe inside, missus. This is company business. This is my riverbank, and you are trespassing." One of them laughed. The other did not. Della raised the barrels and fired one over their heads into the cottonwoods, and the leaves came down through the lantern light like snow. The men scattered, but she heard the axe go into the rope before they ran. 3 heavy strokes, and then the long whipping crack, as 80 feet of tarred hemp went into the water, and the current took it. In the morning the river ran wide and empty, and there was nothing across it at all. Della stood on the gravel with the cut end in her hands. It would take $40 of new rope and 6 men to set it. She had 11 days until the note came due, and she had $4, and she sat down on a cold rock in front of her daughter and put her face in her hands for the first time in 2 years. Winnie stood beside her in one good sock and one grandfather's boot, and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say, and both of them knew it. He came at first light, walking, leading a lame horse. His name was Judd Farrow. He had driven for Marcus Dean for 6 years, and he had a face like a dry creek bed. He stopped at the edge of the yard and took off his hat and held it against his chest, and waited to be spoken to. "I was down there last night," Farrow said. "I held the lantern. I did not swing the axe, but I held the lantern, and that is the same in the eyes of God, and near enough, the same in the eyes of a judge." Della stood up. "Why are you here?" Farrow reached inside his coat and brought out a folded paper and a foot of cut hemp with the axe mark still bright in it. "Because he told us the widow would fire high, and I said she would fire true." And he laughed. "And because my mother raised me, and I have been letting a man in a clean collar tell me who to be." He held out the paper. "That is my hand and my name. Everything he told us to do, and the date he told us. I will say it in front of the county man, and I will say it in front of the whole street." He put the rope end in her hands. "I am sorry, ma'am. It is a poor apology. It is what I have." By noon, there was a wagon on the track. It was the cobbler, Mr. Halloway, with a box of lasts and a keg of nails on the seat beside him, and he said only that a bench with good leather on it and no lasts was a waste of good leather, and he unloaded and went home. At 2 o'clock, the Nyland brothers came down from the north bench with 110 feet of ferry rope off their hay barn, and would not name a price. At 4, the schoolteacher came with a sack of flour and a jar of peaches, and stayed an hour and washed the dishes. At 6, Ezra Coulter's foreman rode in with 9 men, and they set the new rope before dark, hauling it up out of the water hand over hand, while the sun went down red behind the ridge, and not one of them would take a cup of coffee sitting down. Della stood on the gravel, with her arms crossed, and watched her river go back together, and could not make her voice work. And in the kitchen, by lamplight, night after night, she cut and stitched. She made 46 sets of traces for the bitterroot outfit, and she made them better than she had ever made anything, double-stitched at every billet, with waxed linen. And on the last night, when the traces were rolled and tied and stacked by the door, she took the best skirting in the pile, and she cut a pair of boots for her daughter. She built them over Halloway's lasts. She burnished the edges. She set a double row of stitching at the counter, the way her father-in-law had set his, because that was how a Rourke made a boot. She finished at 3 in the morning, and stood them side by side on the table, and looked at them, and then she went to the shelf, and took down the old cut-down pair, with the 5 patches, and wrapped them in flannel, and put them away. Settlement day came on the first Thursday in October. The street was full. Word travels in a valley the way water does, downhill and into every low place, and by 9 o'clock there were 60 people on that boardwalk who had no business in town at all. Marcus Dean sat in the freight office, with his ledger open and his collar white. At 10, a wagon came down the street, with Ezra Coulter driving and Della Rourke on the seat beside him, and behind them rode Judd Farrow and the Nyland brothers and 11 men off the bitterroot. The wagon stopped. Coulter got down and handed Della down, and then he reached up and lifted the girl to the ground. The street went quiet. Winnie Rourke was not wearing harness scraps. She stood in the dust in a pair of new black boots with the edges burnished to a shine and a double row of stitching at the counter, and they fit her, and she stood on them the way you stand on something that is yours. Cyrus Pike, on the porch with his hat in his hand, took a step back into the doorway. Winnie did not look at him. She looked straight ahead. They went into the freight office, and the crowd came in behind them until there was no room left. Dean stood up. "This is a private business. It is a public street and an open door," Coulter said. He laid 3 things on the desk. He laid Farrow's statement. He laid the cut end of the ferry rope with the axe mark in it, and he laid the deed to the building that Marcus Dean had been drinking in and dealing in for 9 years. "You cannot," Dean said. "I did, Thursday last, from the bank in Willow Fork, along with the note on your freight line. You have been borrowing against a stage contract that has not been let yet." Dean's face went the color of paper. "The road will cross where the county says it crosses. The county lets the crossing to whoever holds the landing and can bond the work," Coulter said. "That is Mrs. Rourke, and that is me. I am the bond." He turned and took a heavy folded document out of his coat, and he did not hand it to Dean. He handed it to Della. "Mrs. Rourke, that is a 10-year lease. The line will pay you $420 a year for the use of your landing and the right to keep a ferry on it, and the ferry is yours to run and yours to hire for." Della's hands shook. $420 a year was a new roof and a mule and a school in the fall. "Say yes," Coulter said. "Yes," she said. Coulter turned back to the desk. "Marcus, every account I have with this line closes today, and every rancher on this ridge will do the same by Saturday. Resign it, and be out of the valley by Sunday, or Farrow tells it to the circuit judge, and you go out in a different wagon." Dean sat down slowly in his chair and looked around the room for one friendly face, and did not find a single one. The Deans were gone before the first frost. Nobody missed them. By spring, there were 3 coaches a week down the east bank, and a new landing crib of squared cottonwood on the gravel, and a hand-painted board at the top of the track that said Rourke Crossing. Della took the first year's payment and put a roof on the house and glass in the north window, and bought a red mule that bit. Then she took what was left and built a bench and a shop in the front room, and the sign over the door said Harness and Boots, and she was busy from March on. Ezra Coulter came down the valley often. He would sit on the mended porch with his hat on his knee and drink coffee and watch the ferry go across and back. He never spoke of the note. He never spoke of the deed. He and Della sat together in the way of 2 people who understand what quiet costs. It was in April that he told her. Winnie was on the steps oiling the new boots. Coulter watched her a while, and then he said, "I knew those old boots before I ever heard those men laugh." Della looked up. "I was 14 years old and driving a wagon in the last winter of the war," Coulter said. "The teams gave out, and the mud took us, and I sat down in it because I could not think what else to do. A sergeant came back down the line for me. He carried me 1.5 miles, and he set me on his own wagon box. I never got his name. I was too cold to ask, and too proud to cry, and by morning he had gone up the line again. But I was face down over his shoulder for 1.5 miles, and I looked at his boots the whole way. Black. Double row of stitching at the counter, which no army cobbler ever did. I have looked at every pair of boots on every boardwalk in this territory for 39 years. He turned his cup in his hands. Thursday morning, I looked down, and there they were, on a child, cut down and patched 5 times. I had my mouth open to ask whose she was, and then those men started laughing. Della put her hand over her face. Years later, Winnie Rourke would run the crossing herself, and she would keep the books in a clean hand, and she would send her own daughter east to school, in good shoes bought in a store. But on a shelf above her bench, where anyone standing at the counter could see them, she kept a small pair of black boots cut down at the shaft, with 5 patches sewn in with an awl. People asked. She told them the same thing every time. A person is not measured by what she wears out. She is measured by what she mends, and that is where we will leave Winnie and Della, with the ferry going across and back, and the boots up on the shelf, where everybody can see them. I hope this trip out to the valley gave you a chance to step away from the everyday for a little while and just drift. I would love to know how you listened today. Maybe you were out on the porch, or sipping a hot cup of coffee, or settling in at the end of a long day. Drop a line in the comments. I truly do read every single one. And tell me honestly, did you see it coming that Ezra had been looking for those boots for 39 years? Let me know what country you are watching from as well. We always love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this one, hitting like and subscribing makes all the difference. Thank you for spending this time with